Isabella Wright had always believed that control was the key to happiness, until the one person who made her question everything walked away. Now, standing in the ruins of her own making, she must face the truth she's been running from. Isabella thought she had it all: power, wealth, and control. But when the man she married for a bet walked out, the world she built began to crumble. Her quest for dominance had cost her everything she never expected to care about. Now, with the truth on the verge of breaking her, she must choose between pride and redemption. Will she lose herself forever? Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Isabella Wright sat in her penthouse, perched high above the vibrant chaos of Manhattan. The city lights below flickered like a sea of scattered diamonds, reflecting the energy of a world that was hers to command. She had everything: wealth, power, influence, a life defined by privilege and the unrelenting pursuit of success. Her father, a self-made real estate mogul, had built an empire, and she was the heir to it all. Luxury hotels, fine dining establishments, opulent homes. They were hers to manage, control, and dominate. But despite her accomplishments, there was a part of her that felt like something was missing. At 38, Isabella had perfected the art of control. With her sharp, aristocratic features, piercing green eyes, and effortless blonde waves, she was the epitome of beauty and sophistication. But it wasn't just her looks that set her apart. It was her business acumen. For the last decade, Isabella had shown the world that she was more than just the daughter of a billionaire. She was a force to be reckoned with in her own right, ruthless in negotiations, disciplined in her habits, and utterly in charge of every aspect of her life. Yet, beneath this polished exterior, she felt a quiet emptiness, as though she were living someone else's dream, not her own. Her life was a masterpiece, meticulously curated, impeccably structured. Each morning began with yoga on the penthouse terrace, followed by a breakfast of organic fruit and green juice. The rest of the day was consumed by back-to-back meetings with investors, designers, and high-profile clients. Evenings were filled with charity galas, exclusive parties, and networking events where the same elite faces discussed the same concerns. It was a world that revolved around appearances, where everything and everyone had their place. Romance had always been transactional, an exchange of status, power, and influence. Love, as she understood it, was a concept for the sentimental. But tonight, things were different. It was another gala, another night spent in the glittering world of high society. This time, the venue was the flagship of her family's empire, the Ritz-Carlton, a modern architectural marvel transformed into a dazzling spectacle of crystal chandeliers, white-gloved waiters serving champagne, and guests draped in designer couture. Isabella moved through the crowd effortlessly, her presence commanding attention. Conversations halted as she approached, and when she spoke, people listened. It was the power she had worked so hard to cultivate, the power that had never failed her, until now. She spotted her brother, Alexander Wright, leaning casually against a marble bar, swirling his whiskey. Despite being only a year apart, Alex had always been Isabella's foil. While she had labored tirelessly to build her empire, Alex had enjoyed the fruits of their family's success without the burden of responsibility. He was content with a life of indulgence, amused by the world rather than determined to conquer it. "You always look like you're plotting world domination," Alex remarked with a smirk as Isabella joined him at the bar. She raised an eyebrow. "And you look like you're about to say something ridiculous." Alex chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink before leaning in. "Tell me something, Izzy. Don't you ever get tired of all this?" Isabella's gaze turned pointed. "Tired? Perfection is why I'm successful." Alex shrugged, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Sure, but it's also why you're predictable She laughed softly. Predictable? Everything about your life is curated, he said, a hint of smugness in his voice. Your business, your relationships, your social circle. Everything fits into your world perfectly. Isabella rolled her eyes, but Alex wasn't finished. I don't think you could handle something truly unpredictable. Someone who doesn't fit into your carefully designed reality. Her expression remained amused, though she was intrigued. What exactly are you suggesting? Alex's grin widened, his voice dropping to a low whisper. A bet. Isabella raised an eyebrow. A bet? She had always been fiercely competitive, ever since they were children. To her, winning was more than a goal. It was a need, a way to prove herself superior. I bet, Alex continued, that you can't marry someone completely outside of your world and make it last for 6 months. Isabella narrowed her eyes. Marry? You mean for real? He nodded. Not just date, not a fling. A real marriage. No loopholes, no easy outs. Someone who doesn't belong in our world. Someone you would never even glance at. She studied him carefully, considering the challenge. And what do I get if I win? Alex leaned in closer, his voice dropping even further. The controlling shares of Wright Enterprises. The words hit her like a shockwave. Her father had built the company, but when he retired, he split the final control between her and Alex. The shares were the key to the empire, the ultimate prize. For a moment, Isabella was silent, the weight of the bet settling over her. She had always prided herself on being in control, of knowing the rules and playing by them. But this was different. This wasn't a game she could win with strategy and discipline. It was a gamble, one that could change everything. She finally spoke, her voice steady but tinged with a flicker of excitement. You're on. And just like that, Isabella Wright found herself at the edge of a challenge that would unravel the very life she had built. Little did she know, this unpredictable bet would lead her down a path she could never have imagined, and it would change her forever. Isabella Wright sat in her luxurious penthouse, perched high above the neon-lit streets of Manhattan, her thoughts swirling like the city lights below. Everything she had worked for, her empire, her influence, the life she had meticulously crafted, felt like a beautiful but hollow shell. She had everything the world could offer, wealth, power, and a reputation that demanded respect. But still, there was something missing. The city beneath her was a world of privilege, but it felt more like a prison of her own making, one she had built with precision and control. Everything in her life was exactly as she had planned it. But was it enough? Isabella was a woman of unparalleled beauty and brains. At 38, she had proven herself time and time again in the cutthroat world of high finance, real estate, and luxury. Her aristocratic features, striking green eyes, and perfectly styled blonde waves were only the surface of her dominance. Beneath the polished exterior, she was a force to be reckoned with. She had taken her father's real estate empire, built with his blood, sweat, and tears, and expanded it to new heights. Yet, for all her accomplishments, a nagging emptiness gnawed at her, a void she could never quite fill, no matter how many board meetings she dominated or how many luxurious gala events she attended. Isabella's life was a carefully curated masterpiece, every detail perfected, every person in her world serving a purpose. Yet, deep inside, she longed for something more, something unpredictable. Her morning started with sunrise yoga on her penthouse terrace, followed by organic fruit and green juice. The rest of the day was consumed with meetings and deals, an endless string of back-to-back negotiations with investors, designers, and high-profile clients. Evenings were reserved for charity galas, exclusive parties, and networking events, where she played the role of the untouchable queen of the elite. Romance, that had always been transactional. Relationships in Isabella's world were alliances cold and calculated. Love had no place in her kingdom. But tonight was different. It was another gala. This one held at the Ritz-Carlton, the flagship of her family's empire. The venue had been transformed into a dazzling spectacle, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, waiters in white gloves serving champagne, and guests draped in couture. Isabella moved through the crowd effortlessly, her presence commanding attention. She was used to this. People stopping their conversations when she entered the room, eyes following her every move. She was a woman of power, and that power never failed her until tonight. As she made her way across the grand hall, she spotted her brother, Alexander Wright, leaning casually against the marble bar, swirling his whiskey lazily. Though only a year apart, Alex had always been Isabella's foil. While she had labored tirelessly to build her empire, Alex had contentedly lived off their family's wealth, indulging in the pleasures of life without the burden of responsibility. He was a man of leisure, amused by the world rather than driven to conquer it. "You always look like you're plotting world domination," Alex teased, a smirk playing on his lips as Isabella approached. She raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "And you look like you're about to say something ridiculous." He chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "Tell me something, Izzy. Don't you ever get tired of all this?" Isabella's eyes narrowed. "Tired? Perfection is why I'm successful." Alex shrugged, a wry smile creeping across his face. "Sure, but it's also why you're predictable." She laughed softly, unbothered by his words. "Predictable? Everything about your life is curated," he continued, his voice thick with amusement. "Your business, your relationships, even your social circle. Everything fits perfectly into your world." Isabella rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. But Alex wasn't finished. "I don't think you could handle something truly unpredictable," he said, his voice dropping to a challenge. "Someone who doesn't fit into your carefully designed reality." Her expression remained amused, but she felt a flicker of intrigue. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Alex's grin widened. "A bet? A bet?" Isabella's competitive spirit ignited. She had always been one to rise to a challenge, to prove herself superior. But this was different. "I bet," Alex said, leaning in closer, "that you can't marry someone completely outside of your world and make it last for 6 months. Isabella's eyes flickered with interest. "Marry? For real?" He nodded. "Not just date. Not a fling. A real marriage. No loopholes. No easy outs. Someone who doesn't belong in our world. Someone you wouldn't even look twice at." She studied him carefully, weighing the challenge. "And what do I get if I win?" Alex leaned in, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "The controlling shares of Wright Enterprises." The words hit her like a jolt of electricity. Wright Enterprises was their father's legacy, a company built from the ground up. It was a final key to the empire. Control over the company would give her the autonomy she had always longed for, free from her brother's interference. For a moment, Isabella considered the implications. She was a woman who valued control above all else, and this was a chance to secure it completely without question. "Deal," she said, extending her hand with a confidence that masked the excitement coursing through her veins. Alex grinned, shaking her hand. "This is going to be fun." As she sipped her champagne, Isabella's mind raced. 6 months of marriage. How hard could it be? She had handled multi-million-dollar acquisitions, navigated complex negotiations, and outmaneuvered the most ruthless business titans. Finding a man who fit the conditions of the bet would be no different. She just needed to find someone completely removed from her world, someone she could control. The next morning, she sat in her private study, her cup of black coffee steaming beside her as she flipped through the list her assistant had prepared. Sophia, her trusted assistant, had sourced potential candidates from all walks of life. Struggling artists, cab drivers, school teachers, and even street musicians. But none of them intrigued her. They were too meek, too desperate. She needed someone strong, someone who wouldn't become dependent on her. The arrangement had to be clean, free of emotional complications. A contract, not a relationship. Frustration crept in as she sifted through profile after profile. Each one felt more uninspiring than the last. Just as she was about to toss the folder aside, One name stood out: James Miller. James Miller was a 42-year-old mechanic who ran a small auto shop in Brooklyn. No elite education, no trust fund, no powerful connections. A man who worked with his hands, whose life was as far removed from Isabella's as possible. He was large, over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a heavy-set frame. In a world that prized thinness and refinement, he was an anomaly. What intrigued Isabella most about him was his generosity. He was known in his neighborhood for fixing cars for struggling families at reduced prices or even for free. And, most interestingly, he was deeply involved with a local shelter, dedicating his free time to helping the homeless. He wasn't desperate for anything. He had his own life, his own beliefs, and he wasn't looking for a handout. That made him stand out from the rest. Isabella decided he was the perfect candidate. Within an hour, Sophia had arranged a meeting. Isabella wouldn't approach him as a woman looking for a husband. That would be absurd. Instead, she would present it as a business proposal, something mutually beneficial. She knew how to make an offer no one could refuse. Later that afternoon, she arrived at James's garage. The contrast between her and her surroundings was almost comical. Dressed in an impeccably tailored ivory coat over a black dress, with designer heels clicking against the cracked pavement, she looked completely out of place among the grease-stained floors and stacks of tires. James was in the middle of repairing an old sedan, his hands covered in oil. He barely spared her a glance before muttering, "You lost?" Isabella ignored the condescension in his tone and stepped closer. "I'm looking for James Miller." He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. His dark brown eyes held a mix of curiosity and weariness. "That's me. Who's asking?" She extended her hand. Isabella Wright. He didn't shake it. Instead, he leaned back against the car, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Wright, as in Wright Enterprises?" She was impressed he knew. "Yes," she confirmed. His expression remained unreadable. "And what does a billionaire heiress want with a guy who changes brake pads for a living?" Straight to the point. She liked that. "I'm here to discuss a proposal," Isabella said, her voice unwavering. "One that could benefit both of us." His eyebrow arched, but he didn't interrupt. "I know you volunteer at St. Mark's Shelter," she continued. "I also know that the funding is unstable, and you've been covering a lot of the costs out of your own pocket." His jaw tensed slightly. "Where are you going with this?" "I want to offer you financial support for the shelter," she said, her gaze steady. "Enough to keep it running for years. In exchange, I need something from you." His skepticism deepened. "And what exactly would that be?" Isabella met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "A marriage." There was a long silence. The sounds of tools clanking and a radio playing softly in the background filled the space between them. Then James laughed, a deep, genuine laugh, as if she had told the most ridiculous joke he had ever heard. "That's funny," he said, still chuckling. Isabella stood in the shadow of the towering glass building, her mind sharp, calculating every possibility. The proposal she'd extended to James Miller had been one of sheer audacity. It wasn't just about control, it was about winning. She never lost. And yet, here she was, standing on the edge of something that would either make or break her empire. James had been an unexpected choice. His hands, rough from years of hard work in a Brooklyn auto shop, were not the hands of the men who normally occupied her world. He wasn't a polished executive or a man of wealth and influence. But there was something about him, his self-sufficiency, his unshakable devotion to the homeless shelter he ran, his quiet strength, that made him perfect. He cared deeply, yet he wasn't a man who could be bought or easily swayed. That made him both a challenge and an opportunity. The moment she had extended the offer to him, she knew it was a game she could play better than anyone. But what she didn't expect was a stir of emotion that lingered in his eyes when she mentioned the shelter. That had been the chink in his armor. His heart was bigger than his pride. And so, when she walked away from that garage, she was certain of one thing. James Miller would never be able to say no to doing more for the people he cared about. It had been 24 hours since James had been handed Isabella's business card. 24 hours of wrestling with an offer so insane that it felt like a dream. Marrying a billionaire hotel heiress? It was absurd. But then again, so was everything about Isabella Wright. She didn't just walk into a room. She owned it. She had the kind of presence that demanded attention, the kind of wealth that could drown someone like him in an ocean of excess. And yet, here he was, suitcase in hand, standing at the foot of her empire. James wasn't sure why he'd agreed. He wasn't a man driven by wealth or status, and he didn't need Isabella's money. But then he thought of the shelter, the families, the children. He thought of the late nights, the exhaustion, the constant struggle to keep it all together with nothing but his own hands and determination. And he thought of how much more he could do with her help. He could give the people he'd promised to protect a future. How could he turn that down? And so, he found himself here, outside her pristine penthouse. The doorman's skeptical look was only the first sign that he didn't belong in this world. The elevator ride up to the penthouse felt like a journey into another universe, one where the glass walls gleamed in the perfect, sterile light of unimaginable wealth. It was a world James didn't understand, a world where people were supposed to fit in neatly, effortlessly. He wasn't sure he ever would. When the elevator doors opened, Isabella was waiting. Her appearance was flawless. Blonde hair swept back into an effortless updo, crisp white blouse paired with tailored black pants. She looked like someone who could move mountains with a single look, and James didn't need to be told she was the one in control. "You're late," she said, her voice cold but not unkind. James raised an eyebrow, his own voice tinged with amusement. "Wasn't aware we set a time." She didn't smile, but her eyes flickered with something. Satisfaction, maybe, or approval. "Your room's down that way," she said, gesturing toward a hallway. As he walked in, he took in his surroundings. The penthouse was as beautiful as he'd imagined, but the perfection of it all only made him feel more out of place. This wasn't his world. The sleek surfaces, the minimalist decor, it was too perfect, too controlled. Everything was calculated. Nothing was out of place. "Well, it's a nice place," James said, setting down his suitcase. His voice held no awe, just a blunt honesty that seemed to define him. "It serves its purpose," Isabella replied coolly. "I assume you don't need a tour." "Not unless you're worried I'll get lost," he quipped, his dry humor earning a faint smirk from her. Isabella's eyes turned serious, and the air in the room shifted. "I have rules." "A lot of them," she said. "We will attend functions together when necessary. You will dress appropriately, act appropriately." James met her gaze, unflinching. "Understood. But just so we're clear, this is a business arrangement, not a marriage." "Right." Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered, like she had already anticipated his question, already planned for it. "For 6 months. That's all. We'll both get what we want." He nodded, the weight of the arrangement settling between them. 6 months. 6 months of playing a part in her world. 6 months of keeping a straight face, even when it felt like he was losing himself in a game he didn't understand. But as Isabella turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor, James felt something stir within him. He wasn't just here for the money or the shelter. There was something more. Something about her made him question everything he thought he knew. Could he truly survive in her world, or was he already in too deep? The tension between James and Isabella had been building since the moment they agreed to this ridiculous arrangement. He had thought that he could endure it. 6 months, she'd promised. A temporary thing. But each day, he found himself growing more entrenched in a world that wasn't his, and one that she didn't seem to understand. "You will not embarrass me in front of my associates," Isabella said, her voice cold, yet laced with authority. "And this arrangement is strictly professional." "Understood." James took a moment before responding, his tone heavy with a hint of sarcasm. "Got it. Now, do I get to set any rules, or is this going to be a dictatorship?" She didn't even blink, her eyes narrowing with a sharp edge. "Your job is to stay out of my way. Do that, and we'll get through these 6 months just fine." It was a chillingly simple directive, but James wasn't one to back down so easily. Over the next few days, he quickly realized that their worlds weren't just different. They were polar opposites, irreconcilable in their entirety. Isabella's life was an ironclad schedule. Her mornings were carefully curated, down to the smallest detail. A perfectly portioned breakfast, a to-the-minute timeline of meetings, each conducted with surgical precision. She was a woman who had the world under her thumb, a queen in her own castle. Meanwhile, James' mornings were chaotic in the best way possible. He would rise to a plate of pancakes, drenched in syrup, accompanied by a steaming cup of coffee that was more about comfort than caffeine. Then he'd go out to the garage, elbow deep in engine grease, the scent of motor oil and rust forever lingering on his skin. He wasn't a man who belonged in boardrooms or private jets. He belonged to the streets, to the real world, the one where things got done through grit and sweat. But the first real clash came over something as simple as food. One morning, James found himself rummaging through Isabella's oversized, state-of-the-art kitchen. He opened the fridge to find a collection of ingredients so unfamiliar that he might as well have been looking at alien food. Organic greens, imported cheeses, obscure health juices. None of it made sense to him. So he did what he knew best. He made eggs and bacon, filling the kitchen with the comforting scent of sizzling grease. The sound of her footsteps signaled her arrival, and when she walked into the kitchen, she stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes narrowing at the plate of food like it was a personal affront. "What is that?" she demanded, staring at the plate as if it had committed a crime. James looked down at his breakfast, unbothered. "It's eggs and bacon." Her eyes flicked to him, then back to the plate. "You're going to make the entire place smell like grease." He shrugged, unfazed. "That's kind of how cooking works." She muttered something under her breath, clearly displeased, and grabbed a green juice from the fridge. "We have a chef for a reason," she said. The words clipped. "Yeah, well, I'm not really the tiny gourmet portion type," James said, biting into his food with satisfaction. "I like real food." Her eyes flashed, and she gave a dismissive wave of her hand. "Then don't burn my kitchen down in the process." Their differences seemed to snowball from there, each moment more absurd than the last. She dragged him to a high-end tailor, where he stood awkwardly as they took his measurements for a three-piece suit that cost more than his entire apartment. He'd never worn anything like it, feeling like a mannequin as they dressed him up in clothing that didn't fit who he was, didn't fit the man he was supposed to be. Then, one afternoon, he took her to a small diner in Brooklyn, wanting to show her a part of his world. She stared at the laminated menu like it might bite her. Her eyes flickered with distaste as she carefully ordered a black coffee, visibly repulsed by the greasy burgers and milkshakes surrounding her. At social events, she introduced him with smooth, practiced charm, leading him through rooms of Manhattan's elite, making small talk with billionaires and socialites while he struggled not to laugh at the sheer ridiculousness of it all. He wasn't interested in this world of perfection, of glass towers and plastic smiles. They were oil and water. But what struck him the most wasn't just how different they were. It was how unshakable Isabella was in her belief that she could control everything, even him. Maybe, just maybe, for the first time, she had met someone who wouldn't be controlled. One night, after yet another tense, silent dinner, James found himself leaning against the balcony railing, looking out at the New York skyline. The city below twinkled like 1,000 diamonds, but up here in the penthouse, things felt colder than ever. Isabella stood beside him, her arms crossed, her gaze distant, lost in thoughts he couldn't touch. "This isn't working," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. She didn't look at him, her face as unreadable as ever. "What isn't?" He gestured between them, his frustration bubbling over. "This. You acting like you can just shove me into your world, and I'll fall in line." She was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant as if calculating her response. "You knew what you were signing up for," she said, her voice almost unreadable. James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Yeah, I did. But I don't think you did. She turned to him then, something flickering in her eyes, a crack in the armor. What do you mean? He shook his head again, the words coming out harsher than he intended. You don't just throw money at a problem and expect it to fit into your life. That's not how people work, Isabella. She said nothing for a long moment. Her eyes were distant, but this time she didn't immediately counter him. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize that this arrangement wasn't going to be as simple as she had planned. The penthouse was heavy with the weight of their unspoken words, the tension thick and undeniable. Their fragile truce had begun to crumble, and the quiet battles they fought every day felt like they were building towards something bigger. James wasn't interested in playing the role of a high-society husband, and Isabella was beginning to understand that some things couldn't be controlled, no matter how much money or power you had. Isabella had never been one to be easily rattled, but James had a persistence about him that she couldn't ignore. For days, he had reminded her that she had pulled him into her world without asking for his consent, and in the end, it wore her down. She agreed to visit Brooklyn, but her reluctance was palpable, a tension that hung thick in the air. The drive was suffocatingly silent, with only the hum of the engine breaking the quiet. Isabella sat in the back seat, her arms crossed, her legs crossed tightly. She stared out the window, the city blurring by like a punishment she had no choice but to endure. James, sitting beside her, was more at ease, though there was a quiet anticipation about him, an almost unspoken hope that this visit would crack the ice between them. When they finally arrived, Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The shelter was a far cry from the polished, high-profile charity events she was used to. No sparkling chandeliers, no smiling benefactors posing for photographs. This was something raw. The building was aging, its paint chipped and faded, the sign above the entrance barely visible. The street was lined with people, some huddled together for warmth, others carrying tattered bags with everything they owned. It was a stark contrast to the glittering world Isabella inhabited, and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely out of place. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of food and disinfectant. There was an energy here, chaotic but purposeful. Volunteers moved swiftly, distributing meals, folding clothes, and speaking with residents who wore the weight of the world on their shoulders. It wasn't the sterile, controlled environment she was used to. This place had life, real, human life. And for the first time, Isabella felt like an outsider. James, however, seemed right at home. He moved through the shelter with ease, greeting everyone by name, asking about their families, offering support with a kindness that felt entirely genuine. When a young woman, barely out of her teens, approached him with a toddler in her arms, James didn't hesitate. "We've got a spot for you in the transitional housing program," he told her, his voice warm and reassuring. "You'll have a roof over your head by the end of the week." The girl's eyes filled with tears, and her voice cracked as she whispered, "Thank you. Thank you so much." Isabella felt a shift inside her, a stirring she couldn't quite place. She had attended countless charity galas, signed off on millions in donations, and rubbed elbows with the wealthy elite. But never had she been in the same room as the people her money was supposedly helping. Never had she witnessed the direct impact of those donations. For the first time, she felt something close to guilt. James noticed her hesitation and didn't let her off the hook. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the kitchen. "You wanted to see what I do. Let's get to work." Work. Isabella hadn't expected to be involved. She thought she would simply observe, maybe leave a generous donation at the end. But now, she found herself standing behind the counter, ladle in hand, serving food to people whose needs were immediate and undeniable. The first plate she handed over was to an elderly man whose hands trembled with age. He looked up at her, his tired eyes filled with gratitude. "Bless you, miss," he said before shuffling away, the weight of his life etched on his face. Isabella swallowed hard. This wasn't like the charity events she knew. There were no cameras here, no polished speeches, no donors clinking glasses over champagne. There was only raw, unfiltered need, and people doing everything they could to meet it. By the end of the evening, she felt drained in a way she couldn't explain. Her body ached from the labor, and her mind raced with thoughts she didn't want to entertain. James, ever observant, walked beside her as they left the shelter. The night air was crisp and biting, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the building behind them. "You held up better than I expected," James said, his voice a mix of surprise and something else she couldn't place. Isabella shot him a look, defensive. "Don't patronize me," he smirked. "I mean it. I thought you'd bail halfway through." "So did I," she muttered under her breath. As they drove back to the penthouse, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. For the first time in a long while, she had stepped outside of herself, into a world that was real, messy, and human. But instead of embracing that feeling, she fought against it, retreating behind the walls she had so carefully built around herself. The next morning, the tension between them came to a head over coffee. James was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, while Isabella meticulously spread jam on her toast, her movements precise, controlled. "You seemed different last night," James said, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it, almost human. Isabella's shoulders stiffened. "I don't need your approval." "It wasn't approval," James replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "It was an observation. You saw something you weren't expecting, didn't you?" She hated how easily he saw through her. "I saw a lot of things," she said coolly, none of which changed the fact that money is still the most effective way to help those people. James set down his coffee and locked eyes with her. "That's where you're wrong," he said firmly. "You can't just throw money at a problem and think it'll go away. Those people need more than donations. They need people who actually give a damn." She bristled. "I give a damn." "Do you?" he challenged, leaning forward. "Or is this just another box to check off on your list of accomplishments?" Isabella's grip on her fork tightened. "I built my life on discipline and control. I don't have the luxury of playing savior like you do." James let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think I have the luxury? I work 12-hour days in a garage and still show up at that shelter because I know what it's like to have nothing. You don't." His words hit her harder than she cared to admit. Without thinking, she stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I don't need to justify myself to you." "No," James said quietly, his gaze never leaving her. "But maybe you should ask yourself why you feel the way you do." She turned and walked out of the room before she could say something she might regret. The rest of the day, she buried herself in work, throwing herself into meetings and business deals. But something about their argument lingered in the back of her mind, gnawing at her. That night, as she sat alone in the penthouse, sipping a glass of wine, she found herself thinking about the girl at the shelter, about the way James had spoken to her, not as a benefactor, but as someone who truly saw her. It unsettled her. She didn't like feeling unsettled, but no matter how much she tried to ignore it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. Isabella had built her entire life around the art of compartmentalization. She was a master of separating emotion from action, personal from professional, self from others. It was why she had been so successful. But for the past week, she couldn't escape the unease James had planted in her. It wasn't just the argument. It was the way he had looked at her, like he could see through every layer of indifference she had so carefully constructed. She had told herself she didn't care, told herself that their marriage was still just an arrangement. But the truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about the shelter, the girl with her child, the elderly man who had thanked her so earnestly. She had spent years at charity events, listening to speeches, nodding along with promises of change, but she had never once felt what she had felt that night. Something raw, something uncomfortable, something real. Instead of acknowledging it, she buried herself deeper in work, retreating into the familiar world of deals and contracts. But she knew deep down that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget what she had seen. And for the first time, that scared her more than anything else. Isabella's life had always been a study in precision, in the tight grip of control that allowed no room for uncertainty. She had built an empire, piece by piece, with her sharp mind and unwavering discipline. But lately, as she poured herself into meetings, closed investments, and managed a carefully curated public image, a hollow emptiness had begun to settle inside her, a nagging feeling she couldn't ignore. James, ever observant, noticed the subtle shift in her. The moments when their paths crossed in the penthouse, the softening of his usual smirks, the quiet way he watched her, as if he were waiting for her to confront something she wasn't ready to face. But he said nothing, only letting his silence speak volumes. Then, one evening, something inside Isabella snapped. Without overthinking it, she made a decision. She had her driver take her to the shelter. She didn't tell James, didn't make any phone calls. She simply arrived, stepping out of the car with the same confidence she exuded in boardrooms. But as she crossed the threshold, the unfamiliar weight of the space pressed against her. Unlike the polished charity events or the sleek offices she was used to, this was raw. This was real. And she was alone. No James to buffer the experience, no cameras, no applause. Just her and the people whose lives she had never truly seen. The woman at the front desk greeted her with surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked. Isabella hesitated for only a moment before she straightened her posture. "I was here last week," she began, almost instinctively about to mention James, but the words stalled in her throat. "I wanted to see how things were running." The woman nodded, clearly skeptical, and pointed toward the back. "We could always use help in the food pantry." Help! The word echoed in her mind. It had been years since she had done anything with her hands, since she had worked without the luxury of delegation. But instead of backing away, she nodded and walked toward the pantry. She spent the next 2 hours sorting donations, packing food, and listening to the quiet hum of life around her. No one recognized her name. No one treated her like a CO. She was just another pair of hands, trying to be useful. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was playing a part. Time slipped by unnoticed until she stepped back outside into the cold air, only to find James leaning against her car, arms crossed, waiting for her. "You're late," he remarked. Isabella frowned, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I didn't tell you I was coming." "No," he replied, his tone easy but knowing. "But I figured you might." She studied him, searching for mockery, but instead found a quiet curiosity. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she admitted, her voice softening against the chill. "I don't expect anything," he said, his voice steady. "But I know you, Isabella. You don't do things without a reason." She could have dismissed him, brushed him off, walked away and pretended none of this mattered. But instead, she exhaled deeply, admitting, "I don't know why I came. I just couldn't stop thinking about it." James regarded her for a long moment before nodding once, silently affirming something Isabella couldn't yet articulate. His words were simple, but they hit her harder than she expected. "Good," he said. "Good." The weeks that followed found Isabella slipping into an unexpected rhythm. By day, she remained the confident executive, navigating deals and meetings with the usual grace. But by night, when the penthouse felt too empty, too quiet, she would drive to the shelter. She didn't announce her presence, didn't make any grand declarations of change. She just worked. She packed food, talked to volunteers, listened to stories. Stories of single mothers, the elderly, and children whose lives had been shaped by the harsh realities of the world. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something inside her began to shift. She began to ask questions, real questions. She learned the names of the families who relied on the shelter, the struggles they faced, the hope they clung to. She had always believed that money could solve anything, that efficiency and logic were the ultimate answers. But now, Surrounded by people who had nothing, she started to see that solutions weren't just about funding. They were about presence. And that terrified her. James noticed a change in her, but he never pushed her to talk about it. He still teased her, still made offhand remarks, but there was a gentleness to his teasing now, a quiet understanding between them. One evening, as they sat together in the kitchen, both of them eating in an unusual silence, Isabella finally broke it. "You were right," she said, her voice unsteady. James glanced up, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "The shelter," she said. "About people needing more than just money." He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply nodded, acknowledging her without a need for validation. Yeah, that was it. And somehow, that simple acknowledgement felt more powerful than any speech or lecture could have. It made everything she had begun to feel real. But even as she began to change, as she started to see James in a new light, there was a shadow lingering over her. There was still the bet, the real reason she had married him in the first place. She had never expected to lose. She had told herself she had time, that she could figure out a way to fix it, to make it all right. But deep down, she knew the truth would come out eventually. And when it did, everything she had built in the past few weeks, the connection, the respect, the change within herself, would come crashing down. The weight of the secret pressed harder on her with each passing day. She had always been good at managing risk, at controlling outcomes. But this was different. This wasn't just a business deal. It wasn't a calculated decision. This was real. And it was slipping further out of her control. For weeks now, her life had been split into two distinct halves. The Isabella the world saw, the poised, confident businesswoman who commanded respect, and the Isabella who spent late nights at the shelter, who listened to the stories of the people there, who was starting to question everything she had once believed about success, about value, about what truly mattered. And at the center of it all was James. She hadn't expected to respect him. She hadn't expected to care. But she did. And that was the problem. Because no matter how much she wanted to ignore it, there was still the contract binding them together. The wager, the bet she had made in arrogance, a bet she had never truly expected to lose. She told herself she had time, but the truth came out in the worst possible way. It was an otherwise ordinary evening. Isabella had just returned from a meeting, stepping into the penthouse to find James sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. This was it. The moment everything would change. Isabella Wright had always been a woman of control. Her life a perfectly curated masterpiece, surrounded by luxury, with every move calculated to perfection. But beneath the polished exterior, something gnawed at her. No matter how many meetings she chaired, how many deals she brokered, the emptiness remained. The quiet hollowness, the one that echoed louder than her wealth, couldn't be silenced with success. James had noticed it too. He saw it in the way she carried herself, how her smirks had faded into pensiveness when they passed each other in the penthouse. There was a subtle change in him too, a quiet scrutiny he kept to himself, waiting for her to acknowledge something she wasn't ready to face. One evening, without a second thought, Isabella made a decision. She told her driver to take her to the shelter. She didn't consult James. She didn't make a grand announcement. She just went. Stepping out of the car, she walked with the same confidence that she used to conquer boardrooms. But when she entered the shelter, a heavy unfamiliarity pressed against her. This wasn't her world. She was just another stranger here. The woman at the front desk looked up, her eyes blinking with surprise. "Can I help you?" Isabella hesitated, but only for a moment. Straightening her shoulders, she replied, "I was here last week. I wanted to see how things were running." The woman eyed her for a moment, then nodded. "We could always use help in the food pantry." Without thinking twice, Isabella followed her to the back and worked silently for 2 hours, sorting donations, packing bags of food. She was no longer the CEO, the woman who commanded attention. Here, she was just another pair of hands. The hum of conversations around her became her new reality, And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was playing a part. She was just present. Time slipped by unnoticed until she stepped back into the cold night air. To her surprise, James was leaning against her car, arms crossed. "You're late," he said. She frowned. "I didn't tell you I was coming. I figured you might," he responded, his gaze soft but knowing. "I don't expect anything, Isabella. But I know you. You don't do things without a reason." She paused, searching his face for mockery, but found none. "I don't know why I came," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just couldn't stop thinking about it." James studied her, his eyes intense, but there was something else in them, something that almost resembled approval. "Good," he said simply. The word unsettled her, but she said nothing, unsure of what to say next. For weeks, Isabella found herself in a strange routine. She attended her meetings, managed her investments, maintained her image. But when night fell, the penthouse felt too empty, too vast. So, she went to the shelter, no fanfare, no announcements. She simply worked, packing food, talking to volunteers, listening to the stories of the people who came seeking help. Slowly, without even realizing it, something began to shift inside her. She was starting to see that the solutions weren't just about money. They were about presence. And that realization terrified her. James noticed the change, though he never pushed her for explanations. He still teased her, made light of her efforts to adjust to real life, but there was a gentleness in his tone now, a quiet understanding. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence was comfortable but heavy. Isabella finally broke it. "You were right," she said, her voice hesitant. James glanced up. "About what?" "About the shelter," she replied. "About people needing more than just money." He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply nodded. "Yeah, that's it." But even as she changed, something darker lingered at the edge of her mind. The bet, the real reason she had married James. And she knew that when the truth came out, everything she had worked so hard for would crumble. Days passed. Isabella's life was now divided into two distinct worlds. The polished, powerful woman the world saw and the one who spent nights at the shelter, questioning everything she had ever known about success, about value. And at the center of it all was James. She hadn't expected to respect him. She hadn't expected to care. But she did, and it terrified her. Because no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, there was a contract between them, a bet, and she was beginning to realize that winning wasn't the victory she had once thought it would be. The truth came crashing down on a seemingly ordinary evening. Isabella stepped into the penthouse, only to find James sitting on the couch, his eyes guarded, his phone in his hand. When he turned the phone toward her, her stomach dropped. The screen displayed an article, a column dissecting the Wright family empire. But it wasn't just about business. It was speculation, dangerous speculation, about her marriage to James. "Tell me it's not true," James said, his voice tight-clipped. The words caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of the lie, of the truth she had tried so hard to bury. I didn't expect it to be like this," she said, her voice breaking. James shook his head. "You needed a husband for 6 months. That's it, right? It was just convenient for you. And now, you stand in that shelter and pretend like you care about those people. While all along, this was just another power move for you." His words hit harder than she expected. They were full of pain, of betrayal. She had hurt him in ways she couldn't undo. She wanted to explain, to tell him how much had changed, but the silence between them was deafening. "I thought it meant something," he said, his voice raw. "I believed we were building something real." But Isabella couldn't deny it. She had lost him, and with that realization, the emptiness that had followed her for so long deepened. When James left, the silence in the penthouse was suffocating. Isabella went through the motions, meetings, calls, press appearances, but none of it mattered. James was gone, and she was left with nothing but the weight of her own decisions. Weeks passed. Isabella tried to fix it with money, pouring resources into the shelter. But she quickly realized it wasn't enough. Money had never been the issue. She had lost James because of herself. The cold realization hit her harder than any business loss ever could. And so, for the first time in her life, Isabella did what she had never done before. She listened. She went to the shelter, not as a benefactor or a businesswoman, but as a human being trying to understand. She asked questions. She learned the stories of the families, the volunteers. She sat with them, not as a savior, but as someone who truly wanted to know them. James was everywhere in that shelter. His presence lingered in the way people spoke about him, the trust he had earned. He had built something real here, and she had almost destroyed it. Isabella knew she couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she wasn't ready to give up. She found him in the garage, just like she always had. The familiar scene of him covered in grease, focused on the engine, made her heart ache. She had spent so much time trying to control him, trying to make him fit into her world. But as she stood there, watching him, she understood something she hadn't before. "James," she said softly. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "You're persistent. I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "If this is about more donations, I don't need to hear it," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's not about the money," she said, her voice steady. His brow furrowed in surprise. "Then what is it?" "I've been going to the shelter," she admitted. "Not to donate, to work." He looked at her, his eyes searching. "You?" "I thought I understood what mattered," she said quietly. "But I didn't." "Not really." He studied her for a long moment. "And now you do?" "I'm trying to," she answered honestly. For a long time, they stood in silence. The world around them seemed to pause. But for the first time, Isabella didn't feel the need to control it. She didn't try to force an outcome. She simply waited. Finally, James sighed. "You don't just show up and expect things to go back to how they were," he said, his voice firm. "I know," she whispered. "I know." And with those words, for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't about winning. It was about understanding, about change, and maybe, just maybe, it was a first step towards something better. The days that followed were slow, uncertain. But for once, Isabella didn't try to force an outcome. She didn't rush. She let time do what it needed to do, trusting that the journey, however long it took, was worth it. Isabella stood there, staring at James's phone in her hands, unsure of what to say. Her heart skipped a beat as the words on the screen hit her like a thunderclap. It was an article, a business column analyzing the Wright family empire, with a small section tucked away within it that felt like an icy hand tightening around her chest. The paragraph was buried under speculation, but it was speculation based on undeniable truths. Sources whispered that Isabella Wright's recent marriage wasn't for love. It was a strategic move, a calculated game to claim control of W Enterprises. The whispers in Manhattan's elite circles hinted at a bargain, a deal, a power play wrapped in the guise of a romance. The cold truth seared through her, as the man who had been standing beside her now seemed like nothing more than a pawn in a game she had been playing all along. She looked at James. His face was unreadable, yet she saw the hurt buried deep in his eyes. He didn't need to speak. His silence screamed louder than any words could. His gaze shifted toward her, a mixture of hurt and anger flooding his expression. "Tell me it's not true," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder would break him. Isabella opened her mouth, but no words came out. She felt her throat tighten, her mind racing for an explanation that would make it better. But there was nothing. "Isabella," James said again, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You needed a husband for 6 months, so you found someone convenient. You found me." She flinched at the rawness in his words. Her body trembled, Not from fear, but from the realization that she had hurt the one person who had mattered more than any deal, any contract, any empire. "It wasn't like that," she whispered, though the words felt hollow, even to her own ears. James shook his head, disbelief flooding his features. "Then how was it? Tell me, Isabella, what part of this wasn't just another game to you?" She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him that somewhere along the way, he had become more than just a contract, that his presence had changed her, made her question everything she had built her life on. But she couldn't. She didn't have the words. The silence between them grew, suffocating, as the weight of everything that had been said and left unsaid hung in the air like a thick fog. James's eyes darkened with pain. "I should have known," he muttered under his breath. "I should have known none of this was real." Her heart shattered. "It was real," she whispered, though it felt like a plea rather than a statement. But James didn't believe her. "It was convenient," he said bitterly, his voice sharp, cutting through the air. "You stood there, talking to people in that shelter, acting like you cared, while all along, this was just another one of your power moves." His words hit her harder than she expected. They were more than anger. They were laced with hurt, with betrayal, with a deep sadness she didn't know how to fix. She swallowed hard, trying to breathe through the sharp sting of truth in his voice. "I didn't think it would be like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words escaping before she could stop them. James gave a hollow laugh. "Like what? Like I'd actually matter?" Her stomach twisted. She wanted to apologize, to beg him to believe her, but she knew it was too late. "I should have seen it from the start," he muttered, picking up his jacket and turning toward the door. "I'm done, Isabella." Those words, so final, so cold, struck her like a bolt of lightning. Her composure cracked in that moment, her breath catching in her throat as he walked away. She wanted to stop him, to say something that would make everything better, but she knew she couldn't. The door clicked shut behind him, and the emptiness of the penthouse swallowed her whole. The following days were a blur. Meetings, calls, press appearances. Everything felt like it was happening in a fog. She smiled when she had to, nodded when expected, but none of it mattered. James was gone, and no amount of control could bring him back. She told herself she would move on, that she would forget. But as she passed the chair he used to sit in, or the empty space in the kitchen where he once made his oversized breakfast, she found herself haunted by the absence of his presence. And that terrified her. She had always prided herself on being able to cut ties when something no longer served her. She had built her empire on control, on winning. But now, standing in the silence of her penthouse, she realized that winning meant nothing if she had lost the one person who made her see the world differently. She wasn't ready to admit how much he meant to her, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let things end this way. At first, she did what she had always done when faced with a problem. She threw money at it. She increased her donations to the shelter, arranged meetings to ensure the center had everything it needed for the next few years, new supplies, an expansion project, full funding. She thought that fixing the shelter would fix everything, but it didn't. Money wasn't what had driven James away. It was her, and no amount of money would bring him back. That realization was like a punch to the gut. For the first time in her life, Isabella didn't know how to fix something. And for the first time, she did something she had never done before. She listened. She went to the shelter, not as a businesswoman or benefactor, but as a person. She spent hours there, talking to the volunteers, listening to their stories, learning from the people who had nothing but needed so much. She saw them not as numbers or statistics, but as human beings with hopes, dreams, fears. And for the first time in her life, she felt what it was like to be a part of something bigger than herself. As she spent time there, she saw James everywhere, in the stories people shared about him, in the way the shelter had grown under his care. He had built something real, something that wasn't driven by money, but by a genuine desire to help. She had almost destroyed that, and the thought of it ate away at her. She didn't know if he would ever forgive her, but she knew she couldn't let pride stop her from trying. So she found him, She knew where to look. His garage, as always. He was there, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in grease, lost in the rhythm of the engine in front of him. She watched him for a moment, realizing that in all her efforts to control and manipulate him, she had never really tried to understand him. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. He looked up, his face unreadable. "You're persistent," he said, his voice neutral. "I need to talk to you," she said, her heart pounding. He wiped his hands on a rag, sighing. "Is this about the shelter? Because if you're here to tell me about some big donation, I don't need to hear it." "It's not about the money," she said, and his gaze flickered for a moment. She hesitated before finally saying, "I've been going there. Not to donate, but to work. I thought I understood what mattered, but I didn't. Not really." He studied her carefully. "And now you do?" "I'm trying to," she said honestly. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything between them. And then, finally, he spoke again. "You don't just get to show up and expect things to go back to how they were," he said. "I know," she replied softly. "I lied to you. I know." He looked at her for a long time before shaking his head. "Why are you really here?" For the first time, she didn't try to manipulate the situation. She didn't try to control the outcome. She simply said what was in her heart. "I miss you." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than she expected. He didn't respond right away, but he didn't walk away either. And for now, that was enough. She hadn't won. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, she had taken the first step towards something better. The days that followed were slow and uncertain. She didn't try to control them. She didn't push for an answer. Instead, she let time do what it needed to do. She kept going to the shelter. She kept listening. And for the first time in her life, Isabella Wright wasn't afraid of the unknown. She was ready to show up, not as the woman who had everything under control, but as someone willing to be part of something real. And for once, that felt like enough. If you were moved by Isabella's journey, make sure to hit the like button, comment with your thoughts, and share this video with friends who need to hear this story. Subscribe to our channel for more captivating and thought-provoking stories that will inspire and engage you. Stay tuned for the next unforgettable chapter.